record thing pop up. Should have just popped up for you. And so we'll get started. So tonight, this workshop is presented by the Vermont Beekeepers Association. On your screen, there's Colin Whitehouse, who's a co-host here, and me, I'm Fred Putnam. We're both with the Vermont Beekeepers Association, and we're on the board of directors of the VBA. VBA is what we're going to call the Vermont Beekeepers Association, just for brevity tonight. So when you hear us talk about VBA, it will be in reference to the state association, Vermont Beekeepers Association. So we're really glad that you came here tonight. I know there's a lot of interest in beekeeping, and we wanted to talk about some of the things you really should be thinking about if you're considering being a beekeeper. There's quite a steep learning curve, and there's quite a bit that we need to know to be effective beekeepers. And by effective, I mean being able to keep bees and keep them alive and get them through winter and not have them to succumb to various things that can make their demise happen. So we're going to talk about some of the considerations about being a beekeeper, and we'll get into some of the more detailed stuff a little bit later. This is not a beekeeping class, by the way. I'm going to tell you where the beekeeping classes are located. We're going to be talking about some things you need to think about before you decide to become a beekeeper and before you decide to take that first class. So anyway, we'll get started here. Everybody see that okay? I don't see anybody right now because I'm in presentation mode. So these are some things that we need to talk about or need to think about as we become beekeepers.
Hey, Fred.
Yes.
We just see you.
What's that?
We just see you.
Okay, well, I got to share the screen.
But we see you, not a presentation.
Yes, I had to do this critical little thing called share the screen. So we'll do that here. That should be better. You got that now? That's why I couldn't see anybody. Thank you for that. Thanks for Kim for bringing that up. I appreciate that. It would have been kind of a dull presentation just listening to me talk for a while here. So anyway, considerations for prospective beekeeping. So now beekeeping is called apiculture. It's like a form of agriculture, but it's the practice of raising bees and the methodology behind it, also called beekeeping. And it's more than a noble cause. You know, apiculture is an agricultural endeavor. Honey is an agricultural commodity crop. It's a specialty crop. That's what it's called, a specialty crop, like maple and veggies, apples, things like that. Honeybees are actually livestock by state law. And by being a beekeeper, you're going to be an apiculturist, tending livestock, although the livestock are tiny compared to other livestock that we're familiar with. So the definition to clarify here, and I'm not going to get too much into terms tonight, but as we go along here, if I speak of, you know, beekeeping has its own lingo, its own set of terminology. And if I say something, a term that you're not familiar with, that you don't understand, I don't want to let that slide. I want you to raise your hand or unmute yourself and say, hey, Fred, what do you mean by that? And I will stop and I'll clarify as we go. Sometimes if you don't know if I use a term and you don't know what it is, the point that I'm trying to make might be totally lost, and I don't want that to happen. So you're welcome to interrupt me if I say something and you don't understand what it is. But the two things that we are going to talk about is hive and colony. So a hive, and you see 9 out of 10 beekeepers use these terms incorrectly. So as a starting beekeeper, start using them correctly so that it doesn't create confusion when you're talking to other folks. So hive is the house that the bees live in, and I'll show you some different types of hives as we go through this. And the colony, the superorganism, the colony is the living honeybee superorganism that lives inside the hive. So colony is the living thing, the hive is that inanimate thing that they live in. So some things to consider before you're getting honeybees. You will be stung. It's part of the game. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the sting thing. But if you're afraid of being stung, this is probably not your endeavor. There's also a lot to know, and it takes a lot of time to learn. Getting started isn't cheap, and we're going to talk about cost a little bit later. And we're also going to talk about the learning here a little bit later too. And tending these living creatures takes time. So we'll talk about all of those things in a little bit more detail as we go along. So beekeeping is much more than just the benevolent endeavor, save the bees. And it's more than plunking a hive in the backyard and getting some honey. It used to be that easy, almost, back in the 80s and before, 1980s and before. It really wasn't much harder than putting hives in the backyard and collecting honey later on in the season. But anymore, there are some pests and pathogens that make beekeeping bees alive very tricky. You really have to know what you're doing anymore. And so requires a lot of knowledge. So tending honeybee colonies is a lot of work. When you're starting to lift 40 and 50-pound boxes multiple times, it's a lot of work. And you're often doing it when it's 80 or 90 degrees outside. It also comes with an ethical husbandry responsibility similar to those required to care for animal or bird, livestock, or pets. We're responsible for their care, and the same goes with the bees that we keep. And the bees actually have some extra challenges because they're insects and they're a lot more vulnerable to a lot of things than mammals and birds are. So, commitment needed to be a beekeeper. The first one is time commitment. And as a beginning beekeeper especially, there's a lot of time required to acquire the knowledge necessary to care for the colonies. You have to really understand how to keep the colonies healthy. When they become unhealthy, sick honeybees can infect and afflict neighboring honeybee colonies. So if you have people down the road who have honeybees, or a mile or 2 miles away, your sick bees can make their bees sick, and it also can affect native pollinator populations like bumblebees. And research shows that sick honeybees can also make bumblebees sick and cause them to die off. So we have to be really careful. We really have to know what we're doing to be able to keep our colonies healthy so we don't have these unintended consequences. And we need to be available to care for the colonies during critical times, particularly spring and early summer, when the swarm season happens. And swarming is one of those terms. It's a biological thing. It's the asexual way that a honeybee colony divides. As you probably all know, a honeybee colony has a queen that lays eggs, and that those eggs turn into new little bees. But a colony can also divide themselves, and in doing so, the swarm, it's called a swarm, the queen and then half or 2/3 of the bees in a colony will take off and go find another place to live, leaving behind queen cells and a bunch of other bees. Hopefully those queen cells develop into a new queen, and they have a viable colony. So we have 2 viable colonies instead of 1 after a swarm happens. But that's not necessarily a good thing for honey production. So we're going to, understanding how to recognize that and deal with it is really important. When you have strong nectar flows, stuff really happens very fast, especially here in Vermont. In the month of June, it's absolutely amazing. And a nectar flow, that's a term also. A nectar flow is when plants, trees, shrubs, ground flora are flowering and producing nectar in their blossoms. And the bees are collecting that. So nectar flow happens most of the season after once the red maples start to bloom in the spring and some other things along that line, there will be nectar flowing. But by June, that nectar flow is really strong. There are many kinds of trees and ground flora flowering at that time, so the nectar is widely available. And so that's a very strong nectar flow during June and into early July. So during that time, things happen in the colony really fast, and you have to be around to deal with what happens during those strong nectar flows. And you'll learn kind of when you take a class, you'll learn the kinds of things that start happening. Winter prep in the fall, winter hive checks are critically important, especially that winter prep in the fall. So being available to do that is really important. Regular pest and systematic disease and monitoring control, you have to be available to do that. If you don't do that one, your colony will die, 100%. Unless you got really, really lucky, like 99.99% of the time the colony will die, but you might be in that 0.1% that didn't die, but you got lucky if that happens. You really have to do regular system, and you have to be available, take the time to do the monitoring and control of the pests and diseases. Winter prep actions are really very important, and doing those winter checks also very important. So beekeeping ethics, there's also a financial commitment, and we'll go into a little bit of detail on this and show you what you really need to get started. But you're talking $1,200 to $1,800, $1,900 first year just to get started with that first colony. You can have more than one colony, but the startup costs in the first year, it's not cheap. And I'll show you what those costs are. And there's another commitment to make here. Jeff Battellini, our BBA president, calls this an honesty commitment. And it's recognizing that sometimes the best way for you to help bees, if that's your motivation for wanting to be a beekeeper, sometimes the best way to help the bees, it may not be to be a beekeeper. And we'll talk about what that is here in a little bit. So stings are inevitable, even with personal protective equipment. Even if you suit up, wear gloves, have a veil, all that kind of stuff, sometimes the bees will find a way to sting you through the material you have on. It's very painful. So I've been at this for a while. I run a small business here in Brandon, Vermont, and I have quite a few colonies, and it's inevitable that I get stung. And I have to tell you, even after all these years, it still hurts like heck every time you get stung. And there are certain places where it hurts really badly, like the ankles, where you might not be protected as well. Oh, it hurts really bad. But it goes away pretty quickly. The reactions are what you really have to be concerned about. Swelling and itching, if you're a new beekeeper, are a big thing. First, especially the first couple of years, the swelling and itching might last a few days, and it might last more than that. But eventually that goes away. What's really of concern and something you really need to consider is anaphylaxis. One of my mentees in the past developed, he was a beekeeper for 2 or 3 years, and then had an incident happen and developed a severe reaction to bee stings. And he had a severe anaphylaxis incident happen where it required 3 or 4 EpiPen injections to get him to the hospital and out of the hospital again. So if you're concerned about anaphylaxis, or and if you ever had a reaction before, it's a good idea to see an allergist first, just to make sure they can test and see if you have an allergy rather to bee venom, honeybee venom especially. And so if you're at all concerned that that might be the case for you, see the allergist first. And by all means, stay the heck away from the doctors on Facebook, because you really aren't going to get good medical advice from beekeepers who aren't allergists. So see a real allergist if you're concerned about anaphylaxis. So the state of Vermont has some laws that apply to apiculture, and we're going to briefly cover those. I actually was speaking with our state apiculturist today about some of this. Apiaries, an apiary is the place where you keep your beehives and your colonies in your beehives. That's the place where their hives are located. So that's an apiary. And so that location has to be registered annually. And you'll get, there's a form online that where you can register apiaries. Once you've registered once, you'll get an annual reminder and be able to update your registration every year. And this basically is a communication channel for concerns that it could affect your apiary, like American foul brood. AFB is American foul brood. It's a very serious disease of honeybees, and it also can be, you can get an alert about state mandated mosquito spraying, invasive pests that are potentially going to affect your location. And they might also reach out to schedule an inspection with you if they happen to be in your area. So apiary registration is required. In the law, there's also this thing called a 2-mile rule for apiary location, but this only applies if you have 10 or more colonies and you want to establish an apiary that's not on your own land. So if you're going to have your apiary, your beehives, on your own land, the 2-mile law really doesn't apply to you. You can have as many colonies as you want on your own land. So mandatory reporting, the state law also requires that you report American foul brood. You have to contact the state apiculturist. And when you take a class, you'll learn what American foul brood is, a very serious disease. Because we now have a full-time state bee inspector, state apiculturist, we have not had any cases of American foul brood in the state of Vermont for the last 2 seasons, which is an amazing accomplishment. So the agency, this is the link to the Vermont Apiary Program. It's run by the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. It's an agricultural program. And there's a page there with a lot of information for beekeepers. So that's the link right there. I think Colin may be posting that in the chat pretty soon. And you can actually Google Vermont Apiary Program, and this will pop right up. So our state apiculturist is Brooke Decker. That's her on the left and the right. Brooke actually was just voted the president of the American Apiculturist Association, and which was quite an accomplishment. So we're very proud of her for that. She also is a really easy person to work with. And you can see on the right-hand side here, she's over inspecting some colonies. But that's Brooke Decker, and she's the person who you would be in touch with regarding anything to do with your apiaries, unless she had an assistant, which she sometimes does during the summer. But that's Brooke Decker. She's our state apiculturist and pollinator health specialist. So you can feel free to contact Brooke at any time. And this is her request that we tell you this, and she's welcome, or she asks you to report any diseases just in case you might have a case of American foul brood. But if you're concerned about the health of your colonies, you can request an apiary inspection at that link right there. It's on the Vermont Apiary Program webpage, and she'll schedule to come out and inspect. At certain times of the year, she's pretty busy, so there might be a slight delay, but she is usually pretty. And I have to tell you, never be afraid to invite our state apiculturist, Brooke Decker, to your apiary. Yeah, she's a state employee, but I'll tell you, she's a really good one to work with. Every excuse me, every mentee I've had, and my own personal experience with her coming to my apiaries is she is incredibly helpful. And if you're a new beekeeper, she is incredibly helpful. She's really good to work with, so never be afraid to contact our state bee inspector, our apiculturist, Brooke Decker, if you have a reason to do that. And her goal is to help everyone succeed. Those are her words. And I believe that's in her core, that's what she tries to do. So what do we need to know? Beekeeping knowledge. So terminology, I'm not getting into a deep dive into terminology. This is a beekeeping class thing. But when I talked about specific terminology for beekeeping, there is that deep, medium, foundation, nuke, drone, requeening cycle, swarm cells, supersedures, varroa, AFB. There's pages worth of terminology that goes along with beekeeping. And I have to tell you, when I sat in a class much like this one before I started beekeeping, and the presenter was talking about your first year in beekeeping, and they started talking about deeps and mediums and bee biology that I had forgotten since college, and then this thing called a nuke, and I didn't see the word written, so I wrote on my notepad NUKEE, nuke. Why in the world do beekeepers need nukes? And it turns out the nuke is not NUKE, it's an NUC, it's an abbreviation for a thing called a nucleus colony, which we'll talk a little bit more about here. But terminology can throw you if you haven't had that class to understand what these things mean. And like I said before, there's a fairly steep learning curve, understanding what the state laws are, the bee biology and colony behavior, reading frames, hive box management, pest and disease detection and control. A lot of these things are what you get in classes and then follow-up workshops. And I have a list of where the classes are being held that we'll get to here in a little bit, and also some in-hive workshops that are held at various places too. But anyway, this is all stuff that you're going to need to learn to be a successful beekeeper. So where can you learn that? Well, first of all, the VBA, the Vermont Beekeepers Association website has a page of an outline of a training program. You should really take a look at that before you go too far. It's an outline that starts out from the very beginning. If you're a prospective beekeeper, goes through first year beekeeping, and then it gets on into some second year and beyond, some beyond beginning beekeeper considerations. But you should take a look at that outline to sort of understand the things that you're going to need to know. And then there are Zoom workshops. There have already been a couple so far this year, maybe 3. And there are about 20 overall that the VBA has scheduled between online Zoom workshops, in-person, in-hive workshops. These are out in the field opening up live colonies, and also meetings where we have guest speakers and things and workshops and things like that. So there are 20 or more events like that the VBA is holding this year. So I strongly recommend that the best $15 that you'll spend for yourself will be to become a VBA member, so that these things are available to you. There are some recommended texts in that link, but I think I have some listed here on a slide here pretty soon too. Take a class. Absolutely take a class. I am so glad that I did that when I got started some time ago. It was so helpful. It is not the end all. It's not the end of your learning, but at least it gives you a foundation to start with. You'll have a chance to use a hive tool to open up hives, to pull frames, to look at the frames, to know what drone brood looks like, what worker brood looks like, what a queen cell looks like potentially. But those are the things that you get when you take a class, and I have a list here coming right up. So joining the club or association, highly recommend it wherever you're located. In Vermont, of course, it's the VBA, and there are also many local clubs. There are, I think, 6 active local clubs scattered around the state right now, and I'll list those here in a minute. It's really helpful, too, in the first year or 2 to have a mentor. So the VBA does have a mentor program, but you have to complete a class first. The mentor is not going to teach you how to be a beekeeper. You have to take that class first. It's quite a burden on a mentor to have mentees. It's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. Let me put it that way. And so you can't expect them to teach you what a class teaches you. These 2 or 3 day classes. There are some in New Hampshire that are 4 or 5 days. You can't expect them to teach you. So you got to take that class first. Once you've taken that class, the VBA also has this thing called a beekeeper helpline, and that is also on the VBA website. There's a list of beekeepers around the state, or if you have a question that you didn't anticipate, a situation arises that nobody ever told you about before, you can call somebody nearby you and ask them a question. It'll be a question or 2, talk about your situation, and then it's done. It's not like an ongoing mentoring program. So the other thing about acquiring a mentor is to make sure that your mentor is staying up to date, that their knowledge is current. There are some people around who I've seen helping other beekeepers whose knowledge is woefully out of date, and they're actually giving bad information. So you just make sure that the mentor you have, ask them what have they been doing to keep their knowledge up to date. So the VBA training program, this is a screen print of the homepage of the VBA website. There is a menu called resources, and let me actually get my laser pointer. It says a menu for resources, and when you click on that, there are 2 options. There's one for beekeepers and one for education. Anytime on the VBA website where you see a black arrow, click on the black arrow and more stuff drops down. So the resources for beekeepers, and we click on the black arrow next to education, and a whole other menu pops down, and here's the VBA training program. Here's also the VBA, the beekeepers helpline that I was just telling you about. When you click on that, a list of beekeepers around the state, phone numbers, emails, who you can contact to help you with specific questions. Again, they're not teaching a class, they're not a mentor. This is a single question incident kind of situation that you run into unexpectedly. But anyway, take a look at that VBA training program outline. It'll tell you the topics you really need to be up to speed on. So here are the classes that are being held in Vermont. It's possible that there might be some others, but at this point, this is what we know about. There's a class, Organic Beekeeping for Beginners by Ross Conrad. That's held up in Lincoln, Vermont, in the mountains of Addison County. Better Bee, which is It's a beekeeping supplier located in Greenwich, New York, but they are one of our primary beekeeping suppliers, and they hold a lot of classes. If you get onto their website, and you can look at the classes and events that they have. They're usually pretty reasonably priced, and they're all of these here, by the way. I can vouch for these classes as being very, very good. Pick one, or pick one or two even. They're all for beginning beekeepers. The two on here that are really, really good are this Organic Beekeeping by Ross Conrad, which is a 2-day 9 to 5 thing on a weekend, and a Beekeeping Basics by Deb Rubin. This is a 3-day thing, but it's only a few hours. I forget which nights those are without looking at my calendar, but I think it's 4 or 5 hours each of those days. But those are pretty comprehensive beginners. They really give you a good foundation. Better Bee also has some excellent beginner classes. Sherry Engler at Vermont Beekeeping Supply. The strength with that one is she's in central Vermont in Williamstown near Barrie. She does a lot of in-hive workshops throughout the year. In other words, you go there, you can help open up hives, inspect the colonies, pull the frames, have the frames in your hand, live bees 6 inches from your face, that kind of workshop. And there are some other, there's another place that does that same thing. Also, if you're in the Northeast Kingdom, Northeast Kingdom beekeepers have had a bit of a difficult time lately, but finding mentors and finding classes and things like that, it's a little further away from things. But White Mountain Apiary in Whitefield, New Hampshire, Janice Mercieri holds classes and does private instruction. And you can get onto the White Mountain Apiary website and find out what those classes are, or even contact them for private instruction if that's what you'd like. So there are some other ways of learning. Some people like to learn online. Extension services that deal with apiculture are really good. There are Vermont Extension Service doesn't really deal with beekeeping per se. They do now have a specialist on a thing called sensory analysis, but in terms of beekeeping itself, they really don't have a specialist on staff any longer. New Hampshire does, and there are some online sources. One especially good one is located in Georgia. It's Lawrence County Extension. They have some fantastic speakers, and you think, well, if they're in Georgia, it may be in Florida, actually. But if you think, well, they're so far south that it won't apply to us, but they actually have had some excellent ones that do apply. So these extension service offices that have beekeeping or apiculture programs are an excellent source of reliable information. University, college, USDA labs, the ones that have entomology programs are also good sources for reliable information. And there are a bunch of established entomology researchers around the country. As you get into beekeeping, you'll learn who these people are. Those are the sources that you can really trust. You really have to be wary. I know everybody likes, a lot of people like interacting on Facebook and other social media. And there are a bunch of beekeeping websites, or Facebook pages rather. But I have to tell you, as a new beekeeper, you want to be really careful about trying to use that as your learning mode. And the reason for that is, if you submit a question or make a post on Facebook with a question in it, and even if you have a couple of pictures, the likelihood is that you're going to get 20, 40, 80 answers, and they may be quite different from each other. Those people may not have enough knowledge based upon what they're seeing to be able to answer your question reliably. And so if you're a new beekeeper, so which of those 80 answers are you going to believe? Which of those are you going to rely on? You don't have a clue. Facebook has its applications, but as a learning tool, it's not the best. And so these other sources, the state associations, the local clubs, and these kind of supplemental venues here are really the way you want to lean. And the local classes are the things you really want to focus on when you're in the learning mode. So club association meetings and workshops, the VBA, of course, New Hampshire, Southern Adirondacks over near Malta, Mass Bee Association, if you're in the southern part of the state, or even if you're in the Connecticut Valley, Mass Bee Association meetings are pretty easy to get to. But anyway, any of the state association meetings, they're going to be putting on some reliable information, stuff that you can trust. And as a new beekeeper, and this was hard, really hard for me, and I still remember this to this day. At the beginning, I had no idea whose knowledge, whose advice I could really trust. It took a year or two to really figure out whose knowledge and advice and what sources of knowledge and advice were really trustworthy, that I should really pay attention to. And that's the hard part when you're just barely beginning. Is it your neighbor? Is it some Facebook page you were on? Is, you know, what sources can you really rely on? And that's what we're really trying to focus on here, is the sources of information that you can pretty much trust. Local club meetings in Windham, Bennington, Addison, Chittenden, Franklin, and Caledonia counties. Many of them have in-hive workshops at one point or another during the summer. And so, in fact, I think all of them do. So it's a matter of tying in with one of those clubs and knowing when the classes are being held. And this is where you can be on a club Facebook page, and they will notify you, or on their email list, they will notify you when they have workshops coming up, meetings and workshops. And then in-hive workshops, other than the clubs, the VBA has a South Yard that's not in Windsor any longer. That's a mistake. That's actually in Heartland. They moved it over there last year. It's in Heartland, not just south of White River Junction. Pretty easy to get to. And of course, the local clubs, as I just mentioned, have outdoor workshops as well. Those outdoor workshops are really helpful, the in-hive workshops, when you're very first getting started, because it gives you a chance to look at more than just your own one or two or however many colonies you have when you're getting started. So, recommended texts. There are a lot of beekeeping texts, and there are some more. This Tom Seeley thing, the Honeybee Democracy, he actually has another. Tom Seeley's books are excellent, and he has one or two more that are actually very good. But for beginners, the Beekeeping for Dummies, the Beekeeper Handbook, the First Lessons, Natural Beekeeping by Ross Conrad, etc. These are really good basic books. You can trust the information that's in these books. You don't have to buy these things. Last time I checked with our local librarian, all of these things were available through any library in Vermont through interlibrary loan. You might have to wait a day or two or three. Honeybee Democracy is around $50 now. I mean, if you buy these books, they can add up. But you can also get them for free on loan from interlibrary loan from Vermont libraries. So other sources, Better Bee, that beekeeping supplier I told you about, has a free field day, they call it, every June. They aren't going to have it this year. The next time it will be available is in 2026. They do have a newsletter they send out. Better Bee, by the way, any information you get from Better Bee is also going to be a reliable source. So this Better Bee Buzz, you can get on their website, sign up for it. It's free. It's in what they call the information center at the top of their webpage. And you can sign up for the Better Bee Buzz, and it gives you seasonal kinds of advice, seasonal things that you need to pay attention to. The same as the VBA workshops, they are really focused seasonally as well. What do we need to be doing in May? What do we need to be doing in the first part of the summer, in the middle of the summer, the end of summer, that kind of thing. And the Better Bee Buzz kind of follows that pattern. College classes at VBM, there is a beekeeping class that's being held during the summer at UVM. Cornell has a master beekeeping program. Penn State has a beginner one. I wouldn't rely too much on the Penn State one. It's really awfully basic. A class that you take here at home is going to be a whole lot more comprehensive and useful. Kirk Webster is a beekeeper in New Haven, Vermont, and he has an open house every year. Once you get, this isn't really a new beekeeper thing, but after you've gotten established, maybe second year, third year, it would be good to attend one of his open houses. Mike Palmer YouTube videos. Mike Palmer's videos you can rely on. He has some pretty good stuff. You have to be really careful about, there is some very good YouTube content out there, but you're not going to know necessarily which ones you can trust in the beginning. But Mike Palmer's YouTube videos you can. Mike Palmer is a beekeeper up in St. Albans. He's one of the best queen breeders in the world. And if you ever get some of his queens, you'll know what I'm talking about. So anyway, other sources. So talking about the time required to manage your colonies. So if you only have one colony, the time is a little less. The more colonies you have, the more of a time impact they're going to be. But we're talking about inspections every 7 to 14 days, especially during the beginning of the summer, late spring into the beginning of summer and into early July. You may be able to back off a little bit as the summer wears on, but stuff happens really, really fast in the beginning of the season. So you have to be around to do those inspections. New colonies, like you might be getting, may need additional feeding. And in a class, you'll learn what that's all about. It's not something you're going to continue forever and ever, but sometimes a brand new colony needs a little help to get started. And so feeding is something you'll have to do. Swarm detection and control during your inspections. As I said before, disease and pest detection. You have to think about, if you're making honey, that you're going to have to extract it and jar it too, and that takes time. Checking to make sure that the colony has a queen, maintaining your apiary, in other words, mowing, trimming, maintaining the fences, electric fence, those kind of things all take time. Fall feeding and weighing. Fall is a very, very busy time. It's a critical, the things that you do in mid-September are really critical to the survival of the colonies. So, and you have to be there to do that. And then, of course, midwinter inspections, they're a little less time consuming, and there are some techniques for keeping it simple, but you have to be around during the middle of the winter. If you're a Florida vacation person, this might not work for you. And of course, then you've got equipment cleanup, and that's everybody's favorite job, is cleaning up all the equipment. Not. Anyway, moving on. So what will you need? What am I going to need to have? What sort of equipment do I need to have to be a beekeeper? So one real serious caution. Sometimes you get equipment donated to you, or people say, I'm not using this anymore. I got a bunch of stuff out in the barn. You can have it. Be really careful about that. We had a beekeeper in New Haven area, New Haven, Bristol, Vermont, who 2 years in a row was collecting old equipment that I think his grandparents had that was sitting in a barn. In the first year, his colonies contracted American foul brood, and they had to be burned. The woodenware, the colony inside, everything had to be burned because it was infected with American foul brood. So the second year, he went back and got some of that same equipment, and the same thing happened. So finally, the state bee inspector talked him into finally getting rid of all of that stuff. And unless you can 100% verify that the colonies living in that used equipment that somebody wants to loan to you or give to you, unless you can verify that it didn't have American foul brood, stay away from it. Buy new. American foul brood is deadly. If your apiary gets it, it's serious. But if your colonies get it, they have to be burned. There's no treating American foul brood, or no curing it rather. And American foul brood spores remain viable for up to 70 years. So even if that equipment has been sitting out in the barn since 1950, the foul brood spores can still be active. So you have to be careful about using used equipment. So the bottom line is, be safe and stick with new equipment when you're getting started as a new beekeeper. So there are several hive configurations. The most common one is the Langstroth hive over on the side here. It consists of a base, a bottom board, it's not a deep super, it's a deep brood box, potentially a queen excluder that keeps the queen from moving up into your honey supers, and this is where the honey is collected that you're going to basically extract later on or leave for the bees if they need it. And then a couple of covers, an inner cover and an outer cover. And if you ever take a class, and once you get into beekeeping, you're going to realize that the person who invented this inner cover was an absolute genius. And I'm not going to get into why, but that inner cover is really a critical component in this whole hive. And of course, there's an entrance reducer down here. But anyway, that's a Langstroth. The long Langstroth is the same kind of thing, except it's horizontal instead of vertical, and it doesn't have a bunch of boxes. Um, there are some advantages and disadvantages to the long lang. Um, it's a little harder for bees to work to draw comb as this thing gets wider and wider. Whereas with a vertical, bees like to move upward. They like to make wax. They might make honeycomb. They like to deposit honey, but they like to go vertically. They don't like to go horizontally as much. So long langs have an advantage in that you're not lifting heavy boxes, but they also have a disadvantage in colony development. But in any case, that's an option. Moire hives are another option, and top bar hives they're basically like this long lang, except the frames are inside, are shaped a little differently. They don't have a frame. Actually, some of them do have frames and some don't. But anyway, different options that you could use when you get started. The recommendation, though, at least in the beginning, is to stick with the Langstroth. There are several reasons, but one is that that's the most common kind of hive out there today. And if you want a mentor or somebody to help you with managing your hive, you're going to find a lot more information and people available familiar with the standard Langstroth configuration than some of the other configurations. Start with this, and if you wish to try some other configurations a year or 2 or 3 down the road, you can do that later on. But start with this. It's going to be a lot easier for you to start with. And my recommendation, my personal recommendation, you have a couple of options with the Langstroth, the standard Langstroth hive. Some of the hives, these boxes will hold 10 frames side to side, and some will hold 8 frames side to side. The 8 frame, if I was starting over again and I didn't already have a huge inventory of 10 frame equipment, I would have all 8 frame equipment. The main advantage is the boxes don't weigh as much. When you lift one of these deeps here where my laser pointer is, can weigh close to 90 or 100 pounds when they're really big, when they're really full. 80 pounds is very common. It's not easy to lift something that heavy. These boxes here, the honey supers that are on the top of your hive, those can easily weigh 40 or 50 pounds once they get full. 8 frame colonies are going to weigh about 8 frame boxes rather are going to weigh about 10 pounds less, plus or minus, on average. The other advantage, which I'm not going to get into here, but bees will draw wax out to the edges of a narrow box much easier than they will out to the edges of a wide box. So for a couple reasons, if you decide to become a beekeeper, stick with the standard Langstroth. My recommendation is, and you can choose to ignore this one, is to stick with the 8 frame equipment. I think you'll be happier in the long haul. I wish that I had known this when I first got started. So what about the bees? If you're really going to get into beekeeping, you have to get some bees. So there are a couple of different ways you can get started. There's that infamous nuke, which is short for nucleus colony. A nucleus colony is good if you don't have any drawn comb, and I'll tell you why here in just a second. A package can be more cost efficient if you don't already have drawn comb. The packages have a little more difficulty if you don't have drawn comb. Sometimes they get started just fine, and sometimes they leave because there's no drawn comb for them to use. So it's a little iffier getting packages, but if you have drawn comb already, then packages are fine. So a variety of bees, whether they're Saskatraz, Carniolans, Italians, probably not so much Italians, Russians. Don't be so concerned about the variety in the beginning. Be more concerned about getting your bees from a reliable source. One that sells you colonies that aren't afflicted with some kind of disease or pest that you have to be concerned about from day one. And there are, I'll show you here in a minute, there are some suppliers, some local suppliers, most of which I think are pretty reputable. But the ones who raise their bees here in Vermont are really the ones who create their nucleus colonies here in Vermont are the ones that are probably going to be less likely to have some sort of disease or pest already going in the colony. So a nucleus colony is usually 5 deep frames in a portable box. It's a fully, and the difference between this and a package is that this is a fully functional small colony that has a laying queen and developing brood. Brood is eggs, larvae, and pupae in the cells. In other words, little bees coming along to be adult bees. So this is a fully functioning colony all ready to go. You stick this in one of those Langstroth boxes and add some frames to it, and this colony will go on its own. A package is a little different. It doesn't have any drawn comb. The bees come in a screened box about 12 inches by 8 inches by 8, maybe a little bigger than that. But it's a box that has about 10,000 bees in it, about 3 pounds. And they're all by themselves. There's no frames, there's no brood. And there's a queen in a separate little container that's not yet laying. She's caged. But what you're getting is 10,000 bees plus or minus 3 pounds of bees and a queen, and you have to install that package into a hive and install the queen into that hive as well. And as I said, packages work best if you have drawn comb already, in other words, honeycomb on a frame. If you put them into an empty box and there's nothing there, sometimes they'll start making drawn comb right away, and sometimes they won't. So me, if I'm recommending somebody, the surest way to get started is to get a nucleus colony, especially if you don't have any drawn comb. And again, the variety really doesn't matter that much because most of the bees that you get are going to be actually Heinz 57. They aren't going to be pure anything unless you have some special source someplace. What you're really getting is you might have a queen that has heavy to Carniolan traits, heavy to Russian traits, heavy to Saskatraz, but the bees are really Heinz 57, and it really doesn't matter that they are. In fact, David Tarpey down at North Carolina State University says that genetically speaking, because bees have been moving back and forth across the country and Canada for so many years, that genetically a bee in Hawaii is basically genetically the same as a bee in Maine. So main thing is to get a colony that isn't loaded with some sort of pest or disease in the beginning. And I think here is where you can get that. Vermont Beekeepers Association website, Northern Honeybee Providers has a list of places in Vermont where you can get bees. And again, this session is being recorded, so you'll be able to get these links. I think Colin may be posting some of these in the chat as we go here. I don't know how far along he is with that, but I think he was planning to do that. So what is it going to cost? So startup cost, the first colony, first year, is a little on the pricey side. Electric fence system is really mandatory. Do not try to escape without that electric fence system. Unless you live in the Champlain Islands where they don't yet have any black bears. Black bears will find and destroy your hives and will kill and likely kill the colony that's inside at the same time. So an electric fence system, there is a workshop that's already been recorded. It's available. You don't even have to be a member to get to this one because this is such a critical first step in beekeeping, to have that electric fence to protect your hive. The bear can be the first thing that knocks your hive out, that knocks your colony, that kills your colony. It's the first thing. There are other things that can kill your colony too, but this is the first one that's likely to happen unless you have an electric fence system up. So there's a workshop that's been recorded so that you can see how to build one. They're really not rocket science, but you can take a look at that and see how this. But that's a number one thing. Fence first, bees later. Apiary registration, beekeeping class, books, no cost, but tools, personal protective equipment, some of the tools that you need to manage bee colonies, extracting equipment. If you're going to extract, you have your own extractor. You can borrow an extractor from somebody, and I think one of the local clubs, I think up in Franklin County, they have an extractor that you can borrow. Some clubs do, some don't. Woodenware. Woodenware is the boxes and frames and covers that we saw in that picture, like the Langstroth, the Warray, the long Langstroth, the boxes that the bees come in. This is called a woodenware. The bees themselves, approximately a couple $100 for a nucleus colony, plus or minus. Some are a little less, some are a little more. Packages are generally a little bit less expensive. And then a winter, materials for winter hive prep. So the total for that first year, it's going to run, 1,200 plus to almost $1,900, depending upon various things, which of these other options on the left that you get. But that doesn't even include the extracting equipment, and any extra colonies that you get. Any extra colonies is going to mean another box, another bunch of woodenware, another colony that you have to buy. So it can be pretty pricey to get started. So understand there is a cost to get going. If somebody has some brand new equipment or unused equipment or equipment that is safe, you can maybe reduce the cost of a couple of these items, like the woodenware. But for the most part, you're looking at in excess of $1,000 to get started. And then if you have more than one hive, a little more than that. Second year is a little less. So there's some ongoing expenses, but second year is much less. You get your memberships, of course, apiary registration, replacement frames and foundation, which you won't have to worry about too much in the beginning, but as the years go by, the frames and foundation and the honeycomb foundation is the part of the frame on which bees form beeswax and form honeycomb. So the foundation and frames and the honeycomb gets old and after a while has to be replaced. But that's like a 4 or 5 year down the road thing, sometimes 3 years, sometimes 6 years. But that has to happen. Sometimes you have to feed your bees either in the fall or during the winter. And then, of course, you may have to buy more equipment to house the splits that you make. And I'm not going to tell you anything any more about splits, but splits are where you're dividing a colony and making 2 colonies out of one, or 3 or 4 colonies out of one. It's a inexpensive way to grow your apiary size, the number of hives, the number of colonies. So that's why it's a thumbs up. And by taking a class and getting into the workshops, you'll learn how to do that, and that's a cost-effective way to increase. But anyway, second year beekeeping is not nearly as expensive. Some of those first year costs are just going to be, as the years go by, will seem like they're less and less per year. Once established, you can increase the number of colonies by splits, which I just talked about, and not have to keep buying colonies for yourself. You can also replace losses and things like that with splits that you make. So if you don't do some of this stuff, we focused on what you do need to do, but if you don't pay attention that first year and then subsequent years too, that first year especially, you can lose all of your colonies. They'll, especially if you don't pay close attention to the protocols for pest and disease monitoring and control. And if they're not winterized, if the hives are not, and if the colonies aren't prepped properly and the hives aren't winterized properly in the fall, you can lose all of your colonies the first year. If you have 1, 2, 4, you can lose them all if you don't pay attention to some of the critical things that you learn when you take a class and you attend these workshops. And then you have to buy new colonies and start all over. And also remember, when those colonies died, like we talked about right at the very beginning, they don't just stay put when they die oftentimes, unless it's the middle of the winter. They actually, when they're sick, diseased, they fly out of the hive and they end up landing in other colonies and end up affecting the environment that other native species pollinators live in. And we don't want that to happen. So really have to pay attention and be alert to the learning, especially that first year or two. So, like we talked about before, that noble cause, saving the bees. Sometimes we can help the bees more, not necessarily by being a beekeeper, but by creating favorable pollinator habitat, which is reducing mowing, planting or promoting pollinator-friendly plants, or at least not mowing them down when they're in bloom. Critically, avoiding pesticides. So if you are an organic, if you have a farm stand, growing veggies, have an orchard, um, to the extent that you can, avoid pesticides or use products that don't harm. There are some products out there that are not quite as harmful to some pollinators as others are. So if you can avoid them, if you're a homeowner, just avoid it. Avoid the pesticide, especially insecticides. But if you have other crops you're growing, look into some organic pesticides that don't have the same negative impact on pollinators. Now, here's the other thing that even a lot of beekeepers don't get. Honeybees are incredibly sensitive to so many things, and particularly pesticides. We had and then last year we worked on trying to reduce the amount of neonicotinoids being used in the state of Vermont. Eventually they'll be phased out, hopefully. The neonicotinoids are a neurotoxin that are used on seed coatings. Like if you buy seeds for your garden and they're pink or purple, you're getting neonicotinoid insecticides, and they're a very powerful neurotoxin. Honeybees, a honeybee colony exposed to these kind of insecticides at parts per billion, so that it doesn't really kill them, but it has an impact on them. It can reduce the queen's productivity rate by 35%. You can increase the dwindling rate, in other words, reduce the lifespan of a bee from 6 weeks down to 5 weeks or 4 weeks. And that has a huge impact on the colony size going into winter, to the point where the colonies are smaller going into winter and they don't make it through winter because they're not big enough to stay warm. So if you're a landowner and you want to try to do something good for pollinators, stay away from the pesticides. And of course, you can support causes that are favorable to pollinators. There are organizations that promote things that promote activities, promote laws that are favorable to pollinators, so you can be part of those causes rather than become a beekeeper and probably do a lot of good in the process. So now we've talked about all of this stuff that you need to do and some of the downsides of this, but I'm going to tell you about some of the positives here too. It's a lot of work getting your colonies through that first year, getting them ready for winter. And the first time that you get colonies that make it through winter, get to middle of April, they're starting to fly, they're starting to collect nectar from the first red maple and sugar maple trees and other things growing at the time. The first time that happens, you breathe this huge sigh of relief and you have this huge sense of satisfaction that after all of that effort, they made it through winter. It's a huge accomplishment. And to this very day, even beekeepers who have been doing this for a long time, it's still a sense of relief and satisfaction that our colonies made it through the winter. So that's one of the things. Your work paid off. Secondly, confidence, knowing that learning paid off, that all the time you spent learning what to do has paid off because your colonies made it through winter. And then potentially that first year even, you might get 50 to 80 pounds of honey, depending upon where you're located. I had 55 pounds my first year in my first colony. My mentee down in Mendon, Vermont, outside of Rutland, she had 88 pounds in an 8-frame Langstroth hive. Her first year, she was in an incredibly productive area, and your location does matter. And the cash crop value of that can be $400 to $800 or more if you're selling it. And then a colony that makes it through year 1 is ready to start year 2 with a bang. And man, I mean a bang, I mean a bang. When you start a colony in year 1, it takes them a while to make honeycomb, to build up their supply of honey to make it through the winter. They've got a lot of growing they have to do. But by year 2, they've already gotten that started. They've already made their honeycomb. They don't have to do that anymore. And your colony isn't a nucleus colony anymore. It's a full-size live colony ready to go to town as soon as the weather warms up in late April and May, and they do go to town. So year 2 in beekeeping is absolutely nothing like year 1. And when we teach our workshops, we actually focus on year one beekeeping and also on year two and beyond beekeeping, because they're so very different. But if you manage to get a colony coming through winter, boy, you've got an experience coming that second year, and it's really cool. So anyway, that's kind of the checklist for prospective beekeepers, things you need to consider. Do you want to have any questions or anything you want to talk about here?
A quick question. How effective is the electric fence?
Very
With the-
effective.
Very effective?
Very effective, yep. But they have to be, you take a look at that workshop that we did on electric fencing. And like I said, it's free and available to everybody. They have to be done right. You can have an electric fence that looks really good and be not effective at all. And a lot of times when we hear about beekeepers having bears go through their fence, there are some tips in that workshop, that some things you need to do to make sure that that fence is actually functional. So a pretty fence isn't necessarily functional, but that workshop will tell you how to do that. But if your fence is functional, putting out 10 volts, 10,000 volts or even 7,000 volts, and it's a 1 joule or greater energizer, and your grounding is good and all that kind of stuff, which you get in that workshop, they are very effective, especially if you get the fence up before you have the bees. Once a bear has gotten into a beehive, it's a lot more difficult to keep them out, even with an electric fence, because they know what that honey tastes like. They know what's in there, and it's a lot harder to keep them out. So that's why another reason why the fence needs to come first. It's a deterrent. It's a psychological kind of thing. If you've ever touched, and I don't recommend you do this, but if you ever touch a wire on an apiary electric fence that's really functional, if you touched your head to that fence, it would snap your jaws shut and almost break your teeth. I mean, literally, that's a significant jolt that a bear gets when it touches its nose to that wire or its face to the wire for the first time. But it has to be there first. If they do that, they almost never come back. So anyway, they are very effective as long as you get them up before you have the bees, and you're maintaining your fence. You built it so that it's putting out a deterrent charge.
Very good. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Did you get the voltage?
Are there any rules of thumb for figuring out whether you have the right kind of resources? I live rather elevated, 1,650 feet, and there's mostly forest around me and very few meadows. And I'm just wondering whether there's a good way to judge the resource situation, as you mentioned earlier.
1,600 feet is not too bad. There are beekeepers successfully keeping bees up around 2,000, 2,200 feet. It's a little trickier because the seasons are maybe a month shorter, which means the winters are a month longer. It's a little trickier there. If you're in an area that has mixed hardwood, northern hardwood, and open land, that's probably as ideal as you're going to get for high quality honey production and a good amount of it. The hardwood trees in the spring, red maple, sugar maple are really the thing that bees get started on. You don't really get a lot of honey out of that because they're consuming most of it. But by May, you've got apple trees whose nectar is 50% sugar, approximately, black locust trees, and then a little bit later on, basswood trees, and the volume of nectar that comes from those trees is immense. So if you're in a hardwood forest area, the chances are pretty good that your early season productivity is going to be outstanding. If you have mixed land, even if it's old farmland that's grown up, if you have mixed open land, forest land, that's about as ideal as you're going to get, even at 1,650 feet.
In midsummer, what have you got? I talked to someone who is trying to get there with 100 hives at 2,000 feet, and it seemed like he was feeding in August, and I didn't think that was that seemed like he wasn't at the right place.
Yeah, and that's a sign to you that if that's what your area is like, that's probably what you're going to be facing. There's going to be a dearth. Now, 100 colonies in one spot is a lot, and they can
No,
use,
no, no. This was a place that had eight. He had 8 hives in this particular place that he had to feed them in August.
if that area is similar to your area, then that's probably what you're going to be facing as well. The disadvantage of being in a hardwood forest area is that most of the blooming in that area, in that kind of vegetative community, will stop by the first or second week of July. There's not a whole lot more after that, which is why I'm saying if you had some mixed land, if you've got open land,
Right.
old fields, upland openings, things like that, you'll get a continued nectar flow on through the year. But if you don't have that, then you may not have much of a nectar flow, and that can impact um, how well the colony is prepared for winter. You really want a nectar flow that happens like goldenrod, which happens in the latter part of August and into September, is a major source of nectar as well. And that is the stuff that builds up the hive weight and builds up the resources that the bees need to the food that they need to make it through winter. But if you don't have those kind of things, then you end up having to feed. And so it may not be the best place to have bees.
Yeah, there's a bee inspector of some kind. I know her name, who lives near us. Who I should probably have her talk more to her, because she's from my area.
Is that Brooke?
And yes,
Where are you located?
Andover.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Brooke is down your way. Yeah. So, and any other, if you have other beekeepers in the areas, talk to them about what it's like seasonally. But Brooke has been keeping bees down there for quite some time, and she can tell you the seasonality of your nectar flows, or if there even is one. You know, she can tell you what the kind of nectar flows you get at different times of the year. So that's a good idea. And if there are other beekeepers in the area, talk to them, see what they're doing.
Yeah, I'm a mentoring with a guy in Springfield who you probably know also, and there's another guy in Chester who I've met as well, who's a transplant beekeeper. So all these guys seem to have better resources than what I've got.
Yeah, well, then talk to your neighbors, because those are the ones who are going to have the best idea of the productivity of the vegetative communities that you live in.
Thanks.
Yep.
Hi, Fred. I have a couple of questions. One is about your caveats about using old equipment. Does that really apply only to the woodenware, or would you extend that to also any other tools like hive tools and smokers and things like that?
No, it doesn't. You can sanitize hive tools, smokers, your protective equipment. It's just the boxes, and
Okay.
sometimes even the boxes can be salvaged, but most of the time, if you really want to be certain, they have to be destroyed. It's the boxes, the frames, the foundation, all the beeswax, any pieces and parts that make up the hive, and along with the bees, are what have to be destroyed. But the tools that you use, those can be sanitized easily. The smokers, the gloves, anything, gloves can be tossed or you can sanitize them, but anything else can be sanitized and effectively eliminate or kill off.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
And my other question was, what do you recommend as a hive stand? How tall should they be? I see so many different things, people using breeze blocks and pallets. It's very hard to find a sort of consistent view on this. What would you recommend?
There are probably 1,000 different ways that people mount, the bases that people use. My recommendation, though, is, especially here in the Northeast, to not make them too tall. Number one, the taller your bases are off the ground, the harder it's going to be for you to get up on those up in the air on those bases and deal with boxes that weigh 40 or 50, 80 pounds. So mine sit on cement blocks on the ground. We're not in a place where we get a lot of small hive beetles, and small hive beetles territory, which is a little further south. I mean, you can get small hive beetles, but in small hive beetles, people usually want them a foot or two up off the ground. But around here, you don't have to worry about that. Putting them on pallets is fine. Putting them on cement blocks is fine. You see people building these 4x4 racks sitting on cement blocks that are turned on end so that the bases are 2 feet off the ground. Well, that's That's 2 more feet that you have to be up in the air to pull off your honey supers off the top of your hive. So the bases shouldn't be too tall around here. They don't need to be real tall. The fact, in snow country, even when in snow country, you don't have to worry about the snow building up around these things. So if they're down low to the ground, it really doesn't matter. There's plenty of oxygen flow through snow. So your colonies are not going to suffocate, even if they get buried in snow because they're low down to the ground. So you can do it however you want. There's no law against this. There's no one way to do it, but my recommendation would be don't make your bases too tall, because then when the hive starts to grow, when the boxes start to fill up with honey, that third super is going to be up head high or a little higher. And if you can lift a 50-pound box up over your head, fine. But I can't and I don't. I try to keep my bases low so I don't have boxes that are going up over my head.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Gordon.
Hey, Fred, I'd like to ask a quick thoughts on the flow hive.
I'm not an expert on flow hives, so I'm not going to be able to give you much. I don't have any experience with them. I have a beekeeper friend who has a flow hive. The people who've been keeping bees a long time laugh at them. I'm going to be real frank with you. They laugh at them. People who have them, I guess they work, but I really can't tell you very much about long term. After that first year, things start getting plugged up. You start getting propolis buildup, and I don't know how you deal with that. And propolis is like the glue that bees make. It's like silicone that we use, but they use it as a sealant to plug up holes and things like that. But that glues things together. And over the long term, I don't know how easy that is to deal with in a flow hive. So I can't really answer your question, Keith. There are people who like them okay, but there are a lot of people who don't like them either. So
I think
I'm sorry, I can't help you out with that one much.
Yeah, I'm probably going to be starting with that and keep the honey supers off for a while and just do the bottom broods for 2 years or through the second year, and then add the honey on the top.
You want to really think twice about that in your first year. If starting out with a flow hive and that strategy of not putting honey supers on, because depending upon your location, you may have to have those supers on. Like I said, in a productive area, the colony can make 55 to 80 pounds of honey that you take off and still leave them at 135-pound weight going into winter. I mean, they can really take off. If you're in an area like Gordon was just talking about here, where you don't get much of a late summer nectar flow, you might not have that to deal with. But a lot of places in Vermont, the colonies will really build up quickly. And if you try to go without those supers on there, what they're going to do is plug up the brood area and swarm on you. They'll be gone. So you want to take a class. I honestly would discourage you from using flow hives your first year, and then decide after you've had the Langs if that's something you really do want to get into. But
I'm 3 miles south of the Canadian border in Newport. I don't know if that changes your opinion on anything.
It really doesn't matter that much latitude wise. What really matters is the specific vegetative community you have in your area and how productive it is. That varies from place to place. But the kind of thing you're talking about, I think you probably want to start out with you really want to consider starting out with a Langstroth first, and then decide later if you want to move over to try flow hive as well. First year with a flow hive could be pretty tricky, just because of the location of the brood. I think you're going to find it a lot easier to start out with a regular and be more successful with your colony starting out with a regular Langstroth than with the flow hive. But that's your choice. Yep, that's your choice.
Thanks.
Fred, we missed the question earlier, but you were mentioning something about sanitizing is that something to do with a diseased hive that went through the winter? Because we have a hive that survived the winter, but it looks like my bees have some kind of diarrhea. That I can see this.
Yeah.
The honey.
So, yeah. So dysentery may or may not be a real issue. The thing about dysentery is, we went for a long time with cold weather to the point where the colonies could not take cleansing flights. So if you haven't had bees before, during bees have to go poop
Right.
at some point, and they have to be able to fly to do that. And if they can't, they have to hold it, and they sometimes spread it all around the inside of the hive. It's brown spots and stuff, yellow and brown spots. Now that may or may not be an issue. That's a symptom of one type of a pest called nosema. But it also can just be because they haven't had the opportunity, the warm days, to be able to fly and do what they call cleansing flights, drop the excrement down and come back to the hive. So it may or may not be an issue. Now, here's the thing. If you have a lot of dead bees, take a sample of those bees in alcohol. And if you go onto the Vermont Bee Lab website, they give you the instructions on how to collect bee samples for analysis for nosema. Just to rule out that might be the cause of the dysentery. The Vermont Bee Lab in Burlington on the UVM campus will test for nosema and varroa mites free. All you have to do is mail the sample to them, but get on their Vermont Bee Lab website, get the instructions. You can put them in any kind of small container, a half a cup, third of a cup, whatever you can collect. If you have any amount of dead bees, and send it to the lab, and they can tell you if you have nosema, how much and what type, and if that was the issue that you had that caused the dysentery. But it may or may not be an issue. If you didn't have cleansing flights, that may be the whole cause right there, nothing to do with their health.
Yeah, this was the first day that they really came out of the hive to do
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
It was the first state that they came out of the hive to do their thing. So
yeah. Well, if and that's normal at this time of year. I've got snow. I've got yellow spots all over. I have 18 or 20 colonies in my backyard apiary here, and some more in other places. And there were yellow spots all over the snow. First warm day we had. Which is a good thing. You want to see that. We really look for 3 or 4 cleansing flight days throughout the winter, but this winter we didn't get them.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So you say to put them in alcohol, the dead bees?
About a half a cup.
Yes, isopropyl alcohol. But you can get on the Bee Lab website, and they give you there's written instructions there to tell you exactly what you need to do.
Okay, thanks, Fred.
Yep.
With the bear fence video, does that give you the dimensions that you should have around your hive as well?
It does. Yep.
Okay. Yep. Excellent.
So
Thank you.
Basically, you're looking at if you do strand fences, you're going to be looking at 5 or 6 strands, a minimum of 5 feet high. And if you look at that workshop video, you'll see a bear jump over a fence. That's surprising how high they can actually jump. But the people who are really experienced with jumping bears over in Maine, that if you get the fence up to, if you're using like 6-foot T-posts as your corner posts, and you put the lines up to the very top of the T-post, you're going to have about a 5-foot jump height, and they won't jump over a 5-foot high fence. But that means then you have to have 4 or 5 more lines underneath. But that's spelled out in that workshop. In terms of reach in, you want to have about a 6-foot distance between the hives inside the apiary and the fence. In other words, the fence needs to enclose an area big enough so they have about a 6-foot space all the way around the fence, inside the fence, before you get to a hive. And that way they can't reach in and grab it and knock it over. And there are some specs on the lower lines too, how close to the ground they should be to prevent a bear from digging under, because they'll do that too. The other thing, if you get into beekeeping and if you have equipment stored outside, you need to have your apiary protected. But if you ever store any beekeeping equipment like boxes and frames and things like that someplace, they need to be protected as well, so that the bear doesn't come and rip them all apart when you're not around. And that happens. It actually happened to the club president in the Chittenden County Bee Club last summer. He went away on vacation. He had a bunch of equipment stored underneath the deck in his backyard, and they didn't get into his apiary, but they ripped his stored boxes and frames and all, ripped them all to shreds while he was away. So you have to protect them as well. But yeah, the details are spelled out in that workshop. I think you'll find it pretty easy to follow. Now, the other thing is on electric fencing, if you have any issues, you can call me. I think my phone number is in that workshop, but you can call me and I can guide you through stuff.
Okay,
Happy to
thank
do
you.
that. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions here? Want to talk about beekeeping? Any aspect of beekeeping? Okay. So there's this standing joke, and my wife will attest to this, the validity of this joke, where a beekeeper is sitting in his living room, and these people come and with wearing masks, and they kidnap him, throw him in the back of a car, and take off. And then a little while later, they come back and throw him back into the house and said, "We're giving him back to you. He won't stop talking about bees." So, that's when we get into the chat mode here at the end of these workshops, sometimes that's what it seems like, is we just can't stop talking about bees. It's one of those consuming. The other thing that I didn't mention either, and if you are considering beekeeping, one of the other benefits, beekeeping, everybody who has bees will tell you this. When you're working on your bees, nothing else that's going on in the world matters. You are singularly focused on them. They have your complete attention. It can be the most calming and stress reducing activity that you can participate in. And you think, well, flying bees are trying to sting you, they're buzzing, they're making a lot of noise. Well, sometimes they do. But you're still completely focused on that, and any other troubles you might have in the world, they just melt away because you're so singularly focused on taking care of these bees in front of you. So that's one of the other advantages of being a beekeeper, but you have to take the time to do it. Anyway, one of the advantages.
So, Fred, could you talk a little about trapping swarms? I heard that it can be advantageous to trap swarms that are local because they're kind of adapted to the climate where you are, and they winter better than bees that you get in nukes and things like that. Could you just talk a little bit about trapping swarms? Is it worthwhile?
Sure. That's the common belief, but what you're actually probably catching most of the time is somebody else's bees from nearby. Mile down the road, half a mile, 2 miles down the road.
Right.
It's very rare that you're actually catching a feral colony that has wintered in a tree someplace. And there's really no science. I've not seen any science, and maybe Colin might have seen some here, but I've never seen any science that actually says that a feral colony is any more resistant to pests and pathogens than the colonies that you have in your own hives. But the likelihood with most of the swarms is that there's something that came from somebody else's hive a mile or two away. They're not really any stronger, any less strong than what you already have. That's the reality of most swarms. Swarms are cool. In fact, I got to tell you a little story. The first time I had a swarm happen to me, I had driven my first year before Zoom over 2,000 miles, about 2,500 miles, going to meeting and workshops to learn what to do. I don't do stuff half-baked. I really want to know what I'm doing and doing it okay. The second year, the same way. I started on the same route. And then all of a sudden in July, I had my first swarm. I went out and there were like 20,000 bees in a big cloud. It was like, what the heck now? I've been to all these workshops and meetings and nobody ever said, what do you do when you have a swarm? So on the phone to my trusted advisor, one of my trusted advisor, I'm in Brandon, he's in St. Albans, on the phone. So he calmly tells me what to do. I go do it and they collect them up and it's no big deal. But those kind of things happen. And, you can go to a lot of classes, and this is why the beekeeper helpline or having somebody you can call is so helpful, because stuff happens that nobody ever tells you about in any class that you take, in any workshop. They just don't think about some of these odd things that can happen to you as a beekeeper that your colony will do. So in any case, swarms are kind of cool. they're an amazing thing to watch. They're kind of a fun thing to collect. It's not a hard thing. As long as you got the right equipment to do it. You have to have a home to put them in if you're going to collect swarms. In other words, you got to have another hive to put them in. But they are really cool when it happens. It's an amazing thing. I'll tell you, these honeybees, the more you know about them, the more amazing honeybee colonies are. You know, you think they're amazing to start with. The more you know, they have like, I think it's around 30 or so different pheromones that they use to communicate within the colony and to predators and outside of the colonies, you know, things that would prey on them. But they're like, I think it's 30 or 36 different pheromones that have been identified that they use to communicate with each other. You know, how in the heck did they develop that? You know, we don't know how. It was over a long period of time, but it's amazing that they have such fine communications, probably finer than our communications between each other. They have their own kind of language. The fact that, and this amazes me every year, you have these colonies sitting out in these boxes. You've winterized them. Sometimes they have insulation or wraps and, you know, that kind of stuff. And then the temperature drops down to 7, 10 below zero, and the wind is blowing overnight. And yet, comes to April, they're still alive. It's like just absolutely astounding that they sit in these unheated boxes, and yet they manage to stay alive and come out and be just fine come April. A lot of times. My survival so far is better than 95% this year, and I think most of them will make it on through until April. And it's just amazing that they were able to do that. So even after you've been keeping bees a long time, the more you know, the more amazing the creatures are, and the more you get committed to the endeavor. So we had all these other things that we talked about that are things you need to be aware of, but when you really get into it, well, it can be a pretty amazing endeavor to be in.
Thank you, Fred. I'm going to say goodnight.
Welcome. Anything else here? Well, we will stop the recording and we will call it an evening. Thank you all for standing by here with us, and
Thank you.
this was
Thank
helpful
you,
for you.
Fred.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.
Thank you, Fred.
Fred.
Thank you very much.
Next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Leave.